Okay, thanks everyone for being here, and thank you to the organizers for having me. My name is Pakzad-Hurson. This is a joint work with Diego Gentilo, who is at Amazon Pharmacy, and Fuhito Kojima at the University of Tokyo. And this is about equal pay for similar work. A little bit of background about me. One of my oldest memories from when I was a kid was my dad dropping me off at daycare in the mornings, and he would sometimes tell the other children that I was Robin, Bobby's brother, Bobby's twin brother. I don't have a twin brother or a brother at all, and this was more than 30 years ago, and I'm still talking about it. But okay, this is going to become relevant hopefully in a minute. Okay, so this is a very unsurprising slide. And probably more along the lines of what you were expecting. There exists a difference in pay between men and women in this picture. This is in the US. Of course, one could do this with any number of groups. I'm saying nothing about the causes of this, just to note that this exists and has been documented in popular media and academic work for decades. And there's a notion in which firms play a role, right? Firms of people paying the wages. Firms have some wage setting power, and as a society, we may have different opinions as to the way that the firms set relative wages, and I want the wages to be more equal. And well, a policy that has been adopted quite literally in many jurisdictions, including federal policy in the U.S. and a number of states. Is this notion of equal pay for equal work. It's a great slogan, and exactly this phrase is put into laws around. But I want to interrogate this, and this is really the starting point for this paper. What does equal pay for equal work mean? Well, suppose we have Bobby and Robin here, who are working in the same firm. Okay. I know what the first equal pay, the first equal means, right? I can take the pay of the two, subtract, and there's either a zero or not. But what about the second equal, right? Are Bobby and Robin really equal? Maybe the firm says, Bobby, I guess, has a mustache and he's less trustworthy because of that. But of course, there's this, there's also the sense of even if workers are kind of deemed to be equal, could the firm slightly heterogenize its workers to get around the bias? So this is not something that we are noticing first, but this is actually explicitly done in a number of contexts. So back in the 1960s, when the first equal pay laws in the US came out, if you were around and had a Washington Post subscription, you may have seen a firm owner who said something to the effect of, I really just don't like paying my women as much as my men, no problem. I'll promote all my male secretaries to executive assistant, shut up, right? And of course, this notion of job title proliferation is a way that firms can really get around this policy, and the empirical work on these policies really find some small effects or very small effects, because it's very easy to kind of get around the budget. And now in many places, the law is no longer equal pay for equal work, but equal pay for similar work, or equal pay for comparable work, specifically to avoid this issue. So here's an example of New York State equal pay for similar work law, which says no employee of some group, G, can be paid a wage rate less than the weight that an employee of a different group, G prime, in the same establishment is paid for similar. Right? So I'm highlighting two things here. One is there's this group component. We can think of, back to the previous example, groups might specify gender, and the notion of similar work, not equal. Now, we might wonder, okay, equal, similar, am I just, just using words that probably mean the same thing? I'd like to, try to argue in this slide the answer is no. So almost all states in the US have some kind of equal pay law. And starting in 2016, many states started replacing their equal work for equal pay with equal work for similar pay laws. Okay? California, which is one of the first states to do this, said explicitly this makes it more difficult for employers to justify unequal pay. You can't just, slightly change the job title and get around this. The highest court that has reviewed such a law, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, found that this comparable, which is, we're treating as the same as similar for our purposes, is more inclusive than equal work, right? And the way that they ruled comparable applies is not two workers have to be exactly equal, but in the context of academics, people who had the same title, so full professors in the same department, were all deemed comparable. Do with that what you will. I'm not a lawyer. Okay. So as of now, there are more workers covered by equal pay for similar work laws in the US than equal pay for equal. So there's been this explosion, and hopefully I've convinced you that this. Of course, we don't know how these laws work, and that's kind of where we want to jump in here. Now, on its face, these laws sound, I think, really good, right? So let's consider Robin and Bobby again. Suppose Robin is paid more than Bobby is, and they do similar work. And there's no law in place, but now we pass a law. Okay, so what happens? Assuming that Robin and Bobby are still employed and Robin's wage doesn't go down, this is great for Bobby. Bobby just, he gets a boost to his wage. And we can do this comparison between all pairs of similar workers, and what do we find? Well, the wages are going to increase for all but the person who's paid the most. And the wage gap is going to go to zero, at least within these similar jobs, because everyone's just getting rounded up to the highest paid person. Sounds great. Of course, there were some assumptions in what I put here, right? So assumption is Robin is still going to be employed and that his wage is not going to be. That's what we're going to try to see. Do the employment patterns change? How does this affect wage gaps? And to kind of prime our thinking, let's put ourselves in the position of a firm who is trying to maximize its revenue. And suppose this firm hires 10 workers from a particular group and pays them different wages for whatever reasons it may do so, and has one worker of a different. What do we expect this firm to do? It can't just slightly change your job title and make the problem go away. You could pay everyone the same wage, or you could fire that last one. Now, maybe it sounds like that. Would you really do that? Let's make the example more extreme. Suppose you have 100 workers of group G and only one worker of group 5. At some point, right, we may not like it, but I think we need to come to terms with the fact that most firms would choose perhaps to fire that last one. So we do two things in this paper. So the first is a game theoretic model, which I've simplified a little bit here. But here are the elements of the model. We have two firms, okay, competing for a bunch of workers, and the workers come from two groups. We can think of these as being men and women, for example. Now, workers are going to be differently productive, and we could have bias against one group that the firms have. And the firms can make different employment offers to the different workers. Okay? So we have two firms, a bunch of workers who are different in terms of their productivity. There may be some bias floating around, and they're also from different groups. Now, this equal pay for similar work law, if it comes into effect, binds a cross group in the same way that the New York example I gave you. And the way this works is if the firm hires workers from both groups, then it has to pay everyone a common wage. Why? Because it has to pay the highest paid man the same as, well, it has to pay every man the same as the highest paid woman, and every woman the same as the highest paid man. Of course, if there's only workers from one group, the law doesn't apply. There's nothing explicitly in the law that says what happens if you only have workers from one. And our findings are pessimistic. Okay? So for those of you who are familiar with Bertrand's and Hotelling's price competition models, I've tried to draw you a picture. I'm not a good artist, but those models have the form of, well, if firms are forced to be very similar, they will compete heavily, and if they're allowed to differentiate themselves, they will do so, and they will compete less fiercely because they have local market. And that's what I'm trying to illustrate here. Without this equal pay for similar work law, the firms are going to compete heavily for each work. Now, bias may cause a difference in wages between these groups. So there's nothing to say that the world kind of without the law is good or fair. Right? But our conclusions are not going to depend on that. So think of whatever amount of bias or difference in productivities or whatever that goes into this. This is going to be our base. Once we pass this equal pay for similar work law, the firms are going to endogenously differentiate themselves. And in particular, the firms will segregate the workforce. One firm will hire the men, one firm will hire the women. Okay? Now, because they're specializing, okay, it becomes hard to poach from the other firm. If my firm is the one who's hiring all the women, I'm paying different wages, perhaps. If I hire even one man, that's going to expose me to the bite of the policy. I don't want to do that, right? For the reason with the example. Now, again, for those of you familiar with Bertrand and Hotelling's models, this might sound somewhat familiar. Of course, this doesn't say anything yet about what happens to wages, just about who goes where. Now, that may be an outcome of interest. We probably don't like segregation, although that's not explicitly what these laws were trying to fix. So what happens to the wage gap? What we find is a very clear result, regardless of the bias or difference in productivities, whatever. The majority group is the group that's relatively benefited. If there are more men in the labor market, the wage gap will increase in favor of them. If there are more women in the labor market, the wage gap will decrease, even potentially reverse inside, assuming that the wage gap is in favor of the men. Okay? So the effect on wages is to reinforce the position of the majority. So this leads to two testable predictions that we look at in our paper on segregation and wage inequality. And we take we have some data from Chile, which enacted an equal pay for similar work law in 2009. This was both great for us in the sense that it was a relatively clean sandbox. There were no equal pay laws of any kind in Chile, or actually in any of Spanish-speaking Latin America up until this point. Also, perhaps alarming, it was 2009 when the first law came into effect. Nevertheless, the law specifies two groups, men and women, and only affects firms above a certain size threshold. Okay, so this leads to a very clear statistical approach, diff and diff, for those of you who have seen this sort of thing, to estimate the causal effects of passing this law. Right? So we can compare the effects on the wage gap or segregation in the firms that are treated by this policy versus those that are in the control group not treated before and after. And we find several things consistent with our theory. The first is there's a 3 percentage point rise in the share of gender-segregated firms. So these are firms that have workers of only one gender. Now, of course, in the simple, kind of picture in the model I showed you, this was kind of 100% segregation. There are, of course, frictions that are going to be at play in the labor market that we're not able to capture. But what does follow our intuitions is, well, which are the firms that are most likely to segregate? What we find is there's actually a drop in firms that are almost segregated, right? So firms that have just one worker of the quote unquote wrong gender, right? And so this kind of matches our intuitions. If you're almost segregated, what are you going to do? You're just going to get rid of that last worker to avoid the bite of this. What about wage gaps? Well, there's a 3 percentage point rise in the gender wage gap. Now, there are more men than women in Chile's Chile's economy, so this kind of matches our finding that the wage gap should rise for the majority group. But we can actually disaggregate this a little bit and look at local labor markets by industry and region where there are more men or more women. And what we find is that in female majority local labor markets, the wage gap actually closes, right? So this is exactly following our finding that the majority group is the group that is relatively benefited. So I think this is not great news insofar as segregation is probably not something we like, and increasing the wage gap in favor of the majority is probably not something we like either, at least most of the time. So the question is, is this a type of policy we should give up? And maybe not. Okay, so one of the key forces present both in Hotelling's model and really driving much of our analysis is given the opportunity of the firms to segregate their workforce, they will do so to avoid the bite of the policy. Well, what happens if we remove this incentive to segregate by group? And what we show is that this is all back to the theory. Segregation is fragile to equal pay for similar work if we remove the clause about groups, if we impose hiring quotas, or if we proliferate the number of classes to be 1 million classes. And I can talk a little bit about that offline if anyone's interested. These all break the incentives of firm to segregate by group. And with any of these alterations, what we find is there is a segregation of a form, but this is based on productivity now, not based on group identity. We show that this can close the gender wage gap, but possibly at the expense of causing unemployment at the moment. So, I don't know what the right policy is, but here are some things. Thank you very much, and it was a pleasure to meet you.